Okay, so now that we know the different techniques used to do some cracking, let's talk about the types of attacks. Now, these are typically summed up in about 4 different categories. The first one being a passive online attack. Now, these type attacks, again, they're passive, which means we're not going to have a direct communication necessarily with the machine or with the target. Passive online attacks include things like sniffing the network to see if we can discover passwords going back and forth. Great example of this is FTP. FTP uses clear text by default, and so just sitting there sniffing, we might be able to pick up some passwords. As well as man-in-the-middle attacks. This type of an attack occurs when an attacker places his machine or his hacking device between the source and the destination, and he just handles all the traffic going back and forth. And again, I'm not modifying anything. It's very passive. Hardly anyone can tell that I'm doing anything. I'm just capturing the data, making sure it all passes through me before maybe it goes to a switch. We'll show you a tool coming up here in a minute where we'll do a man-in-the-middle attack. And then we also have sidejacking. Now, sidejacking was actually made famous by a Firefox plugin that was called Firesheep, which basically allowed an attacker to go to any Wi-Fi access point, like at a Starbucks or some coffee shop or internet cafe. And if he was on the same Wi-Fi access point as other users, he could actually steal their cookies in the middle of their transaction and do things like, log on to their Facebook, take over their Facebook session. So again, these are relatively passive. I'm not attacking a specific target. Now there's active online. Now active online is exactly that. It's a lot more active. We know the more active we are, the more chances we have technically to be caught. These type of attacks include things like a hash injection. This is where we actually inject a compromised hash into a current session and then use the hash to authenticate to the network resources. We could also use a Trojan or a keylogger. We're going to talk about those more in detail coming up. In fact, we have a whole course coming up just on Trojans themselves. But when it comes to things like keyloggers, this is where we're going to monitor every single keystroke going on a particular system or a particular target. And all those keystrokes, depending on the keylogger itself, could be transmitted back to the attacker. We also could use, again, guessing. Guessing is extremely noisy. It's easy to detect because usually accounts get locked out. Except for, let's see, which account never gets locked out? We also have offline attacks. These are the really interesting ones because with offline attacks, we have all the time in the world. What we mean by offline is I'm somehow able to get a hold of whatever's storing your passwords and user accounts, and I get to play with it offline. I'm not going to hit that machine. I grab the database, like the SAM account database, or maybe I've grabbed your ntds.dit file, and I can start throwing things like a rainbow attack, as well as a distributed network attack, also known as a DNA, where I'm going to use multiple machines to help me try to crack your passwords. We can also try utilizing pre-computed hashes. Now, what happens here is that an attacker can decrypt each word in a dictionary using a hash function and then compare it to the encrypted password. Now, the downside to this is that it does require a lot of space, but the payoff is that it's extremely fast. The other type of attack would be non-electronic. Now, some of these we've already talked about back in our reconnaissance course. We talked about dumpster diving. This is where we look through trash. Now, that may seem below a lot of you, but trust me, this goes on. I think I mentioned in the reconnaissance course that Oracle caught Microsoft in, shall we say, fibs, because they'd done some dumpster diving in the Microsoft trash bins. Shoulder surfing is another type of attack. This is where somebody's obviously watching over your shoulder or using some type of mechanism. The latest and greatest now is, let's see, I've got an electronic cell phone in my hand that does video. How about if I hold that up to my ear like I'm talking to somebody, but I point my camera to where you're typing in a password? Things that make you go hum. In fact, I'm really paranoid about that kind of stuff. When I'm out shopping, if I'm going to run my credit card somewhere, I always stop and look around and see if somebody's pretending to be on their cell phone and just happens to be pointing my way. And of course, social engineering, which we also talked about in the reconnaissance course. Now, there's another thing we can do with social engineering that kind of is a non-electronic attack, but it's kind of borderline. Very, very famous attack, and that is using what we refer to as a USB switchblade. You're like, what? There's a fight? Now, what this is this is a USB drive that I've gone through and I've configured so that when you plug it in, it goes through and does some really interesting things, like maybe install a keylogger for me, maybe a piece of malware, and it does it all silently, maybe even then emails me your login credentials that I detected. And what I do is I take that USB drive and I just arbitrarily leave it someplace where I know somebody will find it. Like, for example, in a parking lot of a company, or in the main lobby, or in a hallway, near a bathroom, someplace near the target company. Somebody picks that up. What's the first thing they're going to try to do? Yeah, they're going to plug in this bad boy, and bing, they just got pwned.